The next step on our 69 Camaro, called Loose Change, was setting the panel gaps. And what this means is we're trying to set all the panels in place and modify them a little bit so that the gaps between the panels is as nice as it can be. I think a lot of people don't realize how nicely American cars from the 60s used to fit together, especially the more expensive cars. If you look at an all-original 1963 4.5 Cadillac, or a Pontiac, Oldsmobile, full-size Buick, the Chrysler products, or some of the higher line Fords and Mercurys, these cars fit together really, really well. The lower price cars, the Camaro, the Mustang, the Ford Falcon, these kind of cars, we look at them as very cool muscle cars, but initially they were designed to be cheaper cars. And one of the places where the costs were cut was in the fit and finish. So the higher end cars fit really nice, the lower end cars, they didn't fit that great. And there was a real strong emphasis put on how cars fit together in the late 80s when the Japanese and German cars really started to push this envelope again. American cars started to fit kind of loose throughout the late 70s and early 80s, but there was some commercials in the 90s of higher end Japanese cars rolling a ball bearing across all the seams and gaps, showing how precisely they fit. And I think the evolution of electronic manufacturing and computer-aided design allowed these companies to make cars that fit together much more precisely. And if you look at cars today, even the cheap ones fit phenomenally. So we try to establish these new car fit and finish standards, but apply them to the earlier 1960s lower price cars like this 1969 Camaro was new. There's a lot of other factors why these cars don't fit that great if you just take the new panels out of the box and put them on the car. And part of it is you're dealing with sometimes a 45-year-old structure now, and who knows what this car had been through. It might have been crashed or damaged, might have been rusty and been repaired. So you've got those factors. Plus you've got your new panels, and the new panels are pretty precise when it comes to their fit. However, when you put them against original panels or put them against new panels from a different manufacturer, you start to get kind of a mismatch. And the other factor is that all of these pieces need to arrive in your possession from somewhere far away. So it seems like every hood we order has a bend on a corner or some kind of distortion in the shape just from the shipping process. They've been on trucks and trains and boats and everything else. So it seems like we're always working these panels back into shape, even though they might be new right out of the box. Another aspect is when you put the panels on the car, the gap between the door and the fender on a Camaro, for example, to revise that to a newer style standard, there's a bunch of things you can do. And it's important to do all this work in steel and not try to close those gaps with body filler or plastic, because that's asking for trouble. You're asking for a panel to bump another one and crack, and that's bad. So you want to do all this work in steel. And in our case, one example we used is on the rear deck lid. We wanted to extend the lip so that there wasn't such a big gap between the deck lid and the trunk filler panel. And the way we did this is Nathan measured the area out and marked it with masking tape so he could see specifically what he wanted it to look like when it was finished. This car was in a black epoxy primer, and sometimes when dealing with a black car with a black gap, it's hard to see this, the crisp edge. So the masking tape allows you to see everything easier. Then he ground the area clean and used a filler rod, normally used for stick or TIG welding, and used that to add steel to the edge of the panel. Again, we're dealing with the edge of a skin of a deck lid, so it's a really thin piece of steel. So the trick here is you want to tack weld this in place. He used a MIG welder because it also provided a little bit of fill, and jumped every couple, 3-4 inches to place a tack so that he wasn't introducing a whole lot of heat to the panel to warp the rear deck lid so it didn't fit. Once he had his filler rod welded from end to end with tack welds, he went back and carefully did a grinding operation to smooth all those welds out. And again, you just don't want to start at one side and grind all the way across because you're going to introduce a lot of heat, maybe warpage. So grind a little bit here and there to keep it as cool as possible. And when you're done, you now have, in this case, about 1/16 of an inch of added material, so the deck lid will fit that much tighter. When it came to fitting the doors, The first thing we did was bolt the door on, and Nathan used a body spoon and body hammers to make sure the quarter opening was, as good as it could be, and to make sure that the door fit as well as it could before we did any modifications to it. You don't want to just throw the door on and start welding stuff. You really want to make sure everything fits as best it can. The most important gap is the rocker gap along the bottom, because that's not easy to adjust. So you got to make sure your hinges are fresh, that the pins have been rebuilt so the door fits properly, and then start modifying. And in this case, we added a little bit of material to the front edge of the quarter panel, also to the door skin, and then at the front of the door, we add a little bit of material to just make that gap a little more uniform. It's helpful to use a gauge of some sort. We wanted a 3/16 of an inch gap on this car. Nathan found that an open-end wrench had about the right size thickness, and he could quickly and easily kind of glide that over his gap and see where it became wider or narrower. Another trick is also to use a straight edge and lay it across panels to make sure that you've got things going in a straight line. And this process involves, working the doors, working the hood, working the fender edges. On this particular car, once we got the fenders on and the hood and the whole nose put together, we found that the header panel didn't fit. So Nathan went through and cut both sides to narrow the overall width of that header panel, and then re-welded it and ground that to make it fit better. So there's really no limit to how nice you want these things to go. You can refine these gaps forever, but things to keep in mind is that you don't want a gap that's, 1 millimeter, for example, because these pieces need to interact with each other. Like when you open the door and close the door, these cars have a body contour line, and if you open the door and the gap is too tight, that peak of the contour line will make contact. You don't want that. So there is definitely a limit to how tight you can get them in certain places, but this is an area that really it's up to your personal preference on how nice you want them to be. Another thing to keep in mind is that once you get all these gaps finished off in bare steel or in primer, they still need to get body worked and painted. So you're going to put body filler on the car, and you're also going to put primer on the car, maybe a spray polyester on the car, color and clear, and all that adds up, and it will tighten up those gaps more and more. So in bare steel, you might want to leave them a little bit wider than your final desired gap, just because that added material can cause you problems down the road, and Lord knows you don't want these things to make contact after they've been painted. So we've got a lot of photographs of this process on our website at V8TVshow.com. Find the Lose Change project tab, and you can see in greater detail how we made all these pieces fit.